The grocery store was supposed to be simple. Margaret told herself that as she stood in the frozen aisle, one hand tight around the handle of her cart, the other pressing a short list against the metal like it could anchor her to the floor. Bread, eggs, soup, the kind you eat when you don't want to think. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, steady, harmless. The freezers hummed. Somewhere a child laughed, sharp and bright, the sound skipping across the tile. Margaret tried to keep her breathing even. In her world, quiet was never truly quiet. It was just a thin sheet over something deeper, something that could split without warning. A cart will squeal behind her. Not loud, not dramatic, just a long, high-pitched scrape that skittered down the aisle like a match struck to close. Margaret's shoulders jumped. Her fingers tightened until her knuckles went pale. She stared at the frozen peas behind the glass door, as if reading their labels might make the sound go away. The squeal came again, closer this time. Her heart didn't rise gradually. It snapped upward, like a rope pulled hard. Her stomach turned, hollowing out. Heat spread across her skin in a fast wave. She blinked once, twice. The aisle narrowed. The lights felt harsher. The air felt thinner. In the polished metal of the freezer frame, she caught a glimpse of herself. Silver hair tied back, plain jacket, posture too rigid for someone shopping for soup. A face set in the careful expression of someone practicing being normal. A third squeal, and then a sudden metallic clatter. A package dropped. A can rolled. The sound wasn't a gunshot. It wasn't an explosion. It was nothing really. But Margaret's body didn't care what it was. Her mind flashed bright and blank at the same time, like an old television losing signal. The grocery store dissolved. The freezer doors became something else. The bright overhead lights became something else. Her breathing hitched. She tried to tell herself, it's a store. You're safe. This is Tuesday, but safety wasn't a thought. It was a feeling. And her feeling was gone. Someone's voice floated in from far away. Mum, are you okay? Margaret couldn't answer. The squealing cart will became a long whistle in her ears. The clatter turned into a chain of echoes. Her hands trembled so hard the paper list crumpled. She forced herself to look down at her cart. Soup, bread, eggs. Her eyes wouldn't hold on to the words. She started to back up, just one step, aiming for the end of the aisle. If she could reach the open space near produce, she could breathe. Open spaces were better, less trapped. Then she saw them. Not the person first. The dog, a large, calm animal, moved into view at the far end of the aisle, wearing a harness, walking with the steady purpose of someone who belonged exactly where they were. The leash was held lightly by a man with dark glasses. His cane tapped softly. The dog didn't pull, didn't sniff, didn't turn its head to anyone's shopping bags. It simply guided. The dog's paws made almost no sound on the floor. Yet Margaret heard them anyway, her brain pulling volume out of thin air. Her throat closed so quickly it felt like someone had reached inside and tightened a knot. The dog's coat was a warm tan. Its presence filled the aisle like a quiet wall. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't threatening. But her body didn't know the difference between now and then. Margaret's hand slipped off the cart handle. Her grocery bag aft tilted. A carton of eggs slid then fell. The sound of them hitting the floor wasn't loud. It was a soft crack, followed by a wet smear. Margaret didn't see any of that clearly. What she saw was the dog's head turning slightly as if noticing the commotion. Not in alarm, not in anger, just in simple awareness. And that was enough. Margaret's legs buckled. The cart rolled forward, bumping her hip. She caught herself against the freezer door, her palms slapping the glass hard. Mum, someone shouted. The man with the dog stopped. His head turned in her direction, as if the sound had pulled him like a string. The dog paused with him, posture steady, waiting. Margaret's vision tunneled. The grocery store became a narrow tube of light and nose. The freezer hum rose into a roar. The squealing wool sharpened into a shriek. Her chest tightened. Air came in thin, panicked sips. She tried to lift her hand, tried to signal that she needed space, tried to say a simple sentence like please keep the dog away. But her voice didn't arrive. The dog took one step forward, just one egg guided by its handler moving cautiously in the direction of the commotion. Margaret's mind snapped. No, she breathed, but it came out as a whisper. Her hands flew up, not to hit, not to threaten, just to defend herself from the idea of the dog getting closer. Her elbow caught the cart handle. The cart jerked. A row of canned soup wobbled on the shelf beside her, then fell. Metal hit tile. The sound ricocheted through her skull like thunder. Margaret turned, trying to run, but the aisle was too narrow and her legs weren't listening. She stumbled into another shopper's cart. Watch it, someone barked. Margaret's world tilted. She dropped to her knees right there between the peas and the pizza box, hands pressed to her ears as if she could physically push the sound away. She rocked once, twice. Her breathing was loud now, ragged and humiliating. Someone grabbed her arm. A store employee maybe. A stranger. She couldn't tell. Mum, you can't, the voice said, firm and confused. You're causing a disturbance. The word disturbance landed like a verdict. Margaret's eyes found the dog again through the blur. It wasn't barking. It wasn't lunging. It was just standing still like a statue. The handler spoke gently. Easy. It's okay. We'll go around. But Margaret didn't hear kindness. She heard motion. She heard pressure. She heard the old alarms inside her body screaming that something was coming. And then she heard the sound that made everything real again at memory, not echo. Not panic-shaped shadows, the crisp, unmistakable click of a phone camera. Someone filming. Margaret's face burned with shame so sharp it almost cut through the fear. She forced herself upright, hands shaking, hair falling loose from its tie. Her eyes darted for an exit like a trapped animal searching for a gap in a fence. A security guard appeared at the end of the aisle, broad-shouldered expression set. "Mum, stand up. Now." Margaret opened her mouth. The words she wanted were simple. "I'm not dangerous. I'm scared." But what came out was a broken sound, halfway between a breath and a sob. The guard's voice hardened. "You're upsetting customers. You need to come with me." Margaret looked at the spilled eggs, the cans rolling on the tile, the stairs, the raised phones. She looked at the dog, still quiet, still steady. And for a heartbeat, she wondered which of them the world would decide was the problem. Then her knees shook again. And the grocery store place, that was supposed to be simple, came the first domino in a line she didn't yet see. A line that would end in a courtroom. A line that would force her back toward the very thing she feared most. And somewhere beyond that, she couldn't imagine it yet. A line that would lead her to a dog that didn't bark. A dog that didn't chase. A dog that only watched. Waiting. Margaret didn't remember the drive home. She remembered fragments like torn paper fluttering in a storm. The glare of a red traffic light. The soft thump of her own heartbeat in her ears. The way her hands trembled on the steering wheel even after Shed pulled into her driveway and turned the engine off. And she remembered one other thing with cruel clarity. Someone had filmed her. By the time she stepped into her small, quiet house, her phone was already buzzing. A text from an unknown number. Then another. Then a voicemail from someone she hadn't spoken to in years. She didn't open any of them. Margaret set the grocery bag on the counter half empty, eggs ruined, soup dented. She stood there in the kitchen, as if she'd been dropped into the scene and told to act normal without being given a script. Her home was tidy in the way of people who don't want surprises. No clutter, no loud colors, everything in its place. But her chest still felt like it was caving in. She walked to the living room window and stared out at her street. A neighborhood that looked like a brochure, trim lawns, clean sidewalks, mailboxes like little metal smiles. Nothing out there hinted at what had happened. Nothing out there ever did. When the doorbell rang, she flinched so hard she nearly lost her balance. It rang again, then a knock. Not friendly, not casual, official. Margaret held her breath, listening. A voice through the door. "Margaret Hill?" Her name sounded too loud in someone else's mouth. She didn't answer, but the voice continued anyway, like it had the right to. "Mum, this is Officer Ramirez with the city. We need to speak with you about an incident today at Pinnebrook Market." Margaret's throat tightened. She pressed her palm to the wall, grounding herself in the cool paint. An incident. That word, again, like her panic was a public nuisance instead of a private war. She opened the door a crack. Officer Ramirez was younger than she expected, mid-30s maybe, with kind eyes that didn't match the stiffness of his posture. Beside him stood another officer, older and quieter, holding a small tablet. "Ms. Hill," Ramirez said, soft but firm, "we received multiple complaints. You knocked over merchandise, collided with another customer, and refused to comply with staff instructions." Margaret swallowed. I couldn't breathe. Ramirez nodded like he'd heard that before, or like he wanted to believe her. "I understand you were distressed, but people were frightened. Someone nearly fell." Margaret's mind flashed to the aisle, the rolling cans, the way her hands had covered her ears as if she could shut out reality. "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone," she said. Her voice sounded thin, like it might snap. The older officer cleared his throat. "Mum, we're issuing a citation for disorderly conduct. You'll need to appear in municipal court." Margaret stared at him. "Court?" Ramirez's gaze softened. "It's not a criminal trial. It's a municipal hearing. But you need to take it seriously." Margaret took the paper with fingers that didn't feel like her own. The print swam as she tried to read it. Disorderly conduct. Court date. Failure to appear may result in. Her stomach dropped. When the officers left, Margaret sat on her couch and held the citation like it was a live wire. For a long time, she didn't move. Then her phone buzzed again. A message from a number she actually recognized, this Timon she hadn't say, but her memory didn't need help. Tom Danner. It had been years since they'd spoken. A decade maybe. The kind of distance that grows when two people share something heavy and never figure out how to set it down together. The message was short. "Heard what happened. Don't ignore the court date. Call me." Margaret stared at the screen. Her thumb hovered, shaking. She didn't want help. Help meant questions. Help mend eyes on her. Help mend admitting that whatever she'd brought home from war hadn't stayed neatly in the past like everyone expected. Still, her thumb moved. She called. Tom answered on the second ring, like he'd been holding his phone, waiting. Margaret. Hearing her name in his voice was like stepping into an old room and smelling smoke that never quite left the walls. I didn't mean to, she started. I know, Tom cut in quickly. I saw the clip. Margaret's face flushed hot. It's online? It's making rounds, Tom admitted, then gentled his tone. Listen to me. This could go two ways. You show up, you shrug, you say you panicked, and they label you a repeat problem. Or you show up with a plan. A plan? Her voice cracked. Court's been pushing alternative sentencing for stuff like this, Tom said. They don't want to lock people up for a breakdown. They want compliance. Proof you're getting support. Margaret closed her eyes. I don't need support. A pause. Then quietly, Margaret, you barely leave your house. The words landed with the weight of truth. She didn't answer. Tom kept going. I run a rescue facility now. Outside town. It's not a shelter like you're thinking. It's structured. Quiet. We work with animals that have been through a lot. And we work with people too. Margaret opened her eyes, dread prickling down her spine. Animals. Tom exhaled. Dogs. Her grip tightened on the phone. No, I'm not saying you volunteer for fun, Tom said quickly. I'm saying I can talk to the court liaison. If the judge sees you in a supervised program community service with a therapeutic angle, they might waive the harsher options. Harsher options, Margaret repeated, barely breathing. Tom's voice turned careful. There's a possibility they mandate inpatient treatment if they think you're unstable and a risk in public settings. Margaret's stomach twisted. She pictured locked doors, white walls, the feeling of being watched, the loss of choice. Her hands went cold. I'm not crazy, she whispered. I know you're not, Tom said. But the system doesn't always care about the difference between struggling and dangerous. You need to give them something concrete. Margaret stared at the quiet living room, her tidy space, her controlled world. A world that had just been pierced by a squealing cart, wheel, and a calm dog in a harness. Why would you do this? She asked, Tom voice tight. Because I remember you, Tom said simply. The Margaret who kept people alive. The Margaret who didn't quit when everything went sideways. Her throat burned. And because, Tom added, lower now. I know what it's like to be judged by your worst moment. Silence filled the line. Margaret looked down at the citation again. The date circled like a countdown. Her voice came out small. What exactly are you offering? Tom didn't hesitate. A court-approved program. Community service at my facility. It's your last clean exit before someone else starts making choices for you. Margaret's pulse hammered. Tom, she said, almost pleading without meaning to. I'm afraid of dogs. I know, he said. That's why it might actually work. Margaret's mouth went dry. Work for who? For the judge, Tom said. For your record. For the court. Then, after a beat sifter, more personal, and maybe for you. Margaret stared at the dim reflection of herself in the blank TV screen, an older woman with haunted eyes, holding a piece of paper that felt like a verdict. Outside, the afternoon wind shook the bare branches. A faint rumble of distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the neighborhood. Margaret swallowed. Where is your facility? She asked. Tom's voice steadied. 20 minutes past the county line. A place called Haven Ridge. The name sounded like a joke. Haven Ridge. Safety on a hill. Margaret wasn't sure she believed in either. But she looked at the citation again, at the words that threatened to swallow her whole. And she understood something she didn't want to understand. This wasn't about what she wanted. It was about what she was willing to face. Okay, she whispered, the word tasting like steel. Tell me what I have to do. The courthouse smelled like disinfectant and old paper, cleanliness layered over history. Margaret sat on a hard bench beneath a faded poster about community responsibility, hands folded so tightly her fingers itched. Tom sat beside her, not touching, not crowding. Just there, like a steady post in a storm. When they called her name, Margaret's legs moved before her mind caught up. She stood at the small wooden table, facing a judge who looked more tired than angry. Practical eyes. No drama. No speeches. Ms. Hill, the judge said, peering over reading glasses, this citation is not the worst thing you'll see today. But it is a pattern I'm concerned about. Margaret's throat went dry. A pattern? Public disturbances. Reports of panic. Refusal to comply. It raises questions of safety for you and for others. Margaret tried to speak. The words clogged in her chest. Tom leaned forward slightly. Your Honor, Ms. Hill is a veteran. She has a documented history of trauma-related panic. She is not violent. She is overwhelmed. The judge studied Margaret. Are you receiving treatment? Margaret's silence was answer enough. The judge sighed. I'm offering you an alternative. Court-supervised community service at a certified facility, with documentation of participation. If you complete it, the citation will be reduced. If you don't, Margaret's breath hitched. Then we revisit options, the judge finished calmly. including mandated evaluation. Margaret nodded once, sharp and fast. The judge looked at Tom. Mr. Danner, you're responsible for supervision? Yes, Your Honor. Then get her started immediately. The gavel didn't slam. It didn't need to. The decision landed softly, like a door closing. Outside, the winter air was cold enough to sting. Margaret pulled her jacket tight. Tom unlocked his truck. You did the right thing. She didn't answer. She wasn't sure there was a right thing. Only choices that hurt differently. They drove beyond the tidy neighborhoods, past strip malls and gas stations, past the last comfortable signs of town. The road narrowed. Pines thickened. The sky dimmed under a low blanket of clouds. Haven Ridge sat behind a simple wooden gate, the name burned into a plank. Haven Ridge Recovery and Rescue. The place wasn't flashy. No bright banners. No cute paw print signs. It looked like a working farm, clean, quiet, purposeful. A few buildings. A long fence line. A gravel lot with 2 other cars. Margaret's hands began to shake. Tom noticed but didn't comment. He parked and turned off the engine. We're going to do this slow. I can't, she whispered, staring at the gate. You can, he said. You just don't know it yet. They walked in. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, not bleach. Somewhere in the distance, a wind chime clinked softly. Margaret listened for barking. Nothing. That silence made her skin prickle more than nose would have. Inside the main building, a woman at the front desk greeted Tom warmly, then glanced at Margaret with careful kindness like she'd been trained not to stare. Tom signed papers. Margaret's name was written down, her court order clipped to a file. Her life reduced to forms. Then Tom led her out back. A row of kennels stood along a fenced corridor. Each space was clean, each gate reinforced. Not prison-like, just secure, as if the place had learned not to trust the world. Margaret's breath grew shallow. Tom stopped near the middle, where one kennel was covered with a tarp, shielding the inside from direct view. That one? Margaret asked, already knowing she didn't want the answer. Tom's expression tightened. Yeah. He pulled the tarp back halfway. At first, Margaret saw only shadow. Then a shape shifted, large, still, pressed into the farthest corner. A dog, bigger than she expected. Thick frame, broad head, tawny coat dusted with darker markings. Its ears were lowered, not pinned, just tired. A heavy chain collar sat round its neck, though the chain itself was gone. The skin beneath looked rubbed raw in places, as if metal had once lived there. The dog didn't bark. It didn't growl. It lifted its head slowly, and looked at her. Not with excitement, not with warning, with an emptiness so complete it was almost quiet on the inside of Margaret's chest. Two ruins staring at each other through steel. Margaret's mouth went dry. Her first instinct was to step back, to put distance between herself and those eyes. But she couldn't stop looking, because the dog's gaze wasn't demanding anything. It wasn't asking to be loved. It wasn't even asking to be saved. It was simply there. Tom's voice came low. His name is Atlas. Margaret swallowed. Why Atlas? Tom didn't take his eyes off the kennel. Because he's been carrying too much for too long. Atlas blinked onto slow, deliberate. His eyes didn't leave Margaret's face. And then, as if he decided she wasn't worth the effort, he lowered his head back onto his paws. That small motion hit Margaret harder than any bark could have. She felt it, an ache, sharp and unfamiliar, blooming behind her ribs. He's been in trouble, she managed. Tom's jaw tightened. He was found in a place I don't want to describe. He was used, forced into things no animal should ever be forced into. Margaret's stomach turned, not with disgust, but with recognition. Used, forced, survive. Atlas shifted again, the chain collar clinking faintly against the metal tag. That sound on metal was soft. Still, Margaret flinched. Tom watched her reaction, then spoke gently, like he was placing a fragile object on a table. This is your assignment, he said. Not to pet him, not to fix him in a day. Just to show up. Margaret stared at the dog in the corner, the silence, the hollow eyes. Her pulse thundered. Why would you put me with him? She whispered. Tom's voice was steady. Because you're the first person he hasn't reacted to. Margaret's breath caught. Atlas didn't bark. He didn't lunge. He didn't perform. He only watched. And somehow, that made Margaret more afraid than anything else. Because it felt like he could see straight through her, past the tidy jacket, past the controlled posture. Down to the place inside her that still didn't believe she deserved to come home. Margaret told herself she was only here because the judge said so. That was the story she repeated in her head as Tom walked her through the facility's rules. No sudden movements near kennels, no reaching fingers through bars, no raised voices, no assumptions. Every step had a reason. Every rule sounded like it was written for something that had once broken. Your hours are logged, Tom said, handing her a clipboard. You'll sign in, you'll sign out. The court wants consistency. Margaret nodded, but her eyes kept drifting back toward the kennel corridor toward the quiet space where Atlas had been pressed into shadow like he was trying to vanish. Tom didn't make her go closer. He led her instead to a small office with a single chair facing a desk. A binder sat there, thick with reports. Medical history, he explained. Behavior assessments. Intake notes. Margaret sat stiffly. The chair squeaked under her weight, and she froze until the sound died. Tom pointed to the binder. Read. Learn. It's safer for you to understand what you're dealing with. Margaret flipped the first page. Atlas intake summary. Size large. Temperament shut down. Minimal vocalization. Hypervigilant responses to sudden news. Triggers metal clinks. Loud bangs. Raised hands. Male voices. Notes, scar tissue around neck consistent with prolonged restraint. Severe distrust of touch. No bite incidents since intake, but history unknown. Unknown. That word hovered like a threat. Margaret's pulse kicked up again. She pushed the binder away as if it were hot. I can't do this, she said. Tom leaned against the door frame, arms folded, not blocking her exit but making it clear he wouldn't let her flee without facing the sentence. You don't have to touch him. That's not the point, Margaret snapped, then immediately regretted the sharpness in her voice. Her chest tightened. She inhaled carefully, forcing the air to move. Tom's expression softened. Then what is the point? Margaret stared at the desk. At the clean edges. At the neat stack of pens. She wanted to say, the point is I can't be near dogs without my body turning into a battlefield. But the words felt humiliating. Instead she said, I don't belong here. Tom didn't argue. He just asked, where do you belong then? The question landed in the quiet room and stayed there. Margaret had no answer. That afternoon, Tom assigned her simple tasks far from the kennels, washing water bowls, folding towels, organizing supplies. Work that had clear steps and predictable outcomes. Work she could control. But even as she worked, she could feel Atlas' presence like a weight across the property. Like a storm cloud you can't stop checking, even if the sky looks clear. The next morning, she arrived early. The gravel crunched under her boots, and the sound jolted her nerves. She paused, listened. No barking. No chaos. Only wind in trees and the distant clink of a gate latch. Inside, she signed her name on the log sheet with a hand that didn't quite steady. Tom met her in the corridor and nodded toward the kennels. 5 meters, he said simply, as if reading her mind. That's your starting point. Margaret stopped short of the kennel line. 5 meters felt like 5 miles. She stood with her back to Atlas' enclosure, like he didn't exist. Like she was just facing the opposite wall, studying a faded bulletin board with adoption flyers and therapy schedules. Her heart beat hard anyway. She could feel him behind her. Not physically, she wasn't foolish enough to believe in that, but in the way her body held tension, as if it were preparing to be attacked. Tom handed her a stack of printed pages. These are general medical reports. Read them out loud. Margaret blinked. Out loud? Yep. Why? Tom pointed to a small monitor attached to the kennel wall across from her, a screen with a slow pulsing line. That's a heart rate monitor. Atlas wears a soft sensor collar when he tolerates it. Right now he's wearing it. Margaret's throat tightened. He tolerates it. Barely. We're tracking stress levels. Trying to map what calms him. What spikes him. Margaret stared at the monitor. The line rose and fell uneven, restless. Tom added, you don't have to face him. Just read. Margaret looked down at the first page. It was dry, clinical, full of terms and numbers. Safe words. Words that didn't carry teeth. She cleared her throat. The sound scraped. She took a breath and began. Behavioral observation subject displays hypervigilance. Her voice was flat, almost monotone, as if she were reading a manual. She kept her eyes on the paper, refusing to turn around. At first, the monitor line jumped, spiked, then steadied, not dramatically, just enough to be noticed. Margaret paused mid-sentence. Tom leaned in slightly, watching the screen. Keep going. Margaret swallowed and continued. Subject shows diminished startle response when exposed to consistent low-frequency sound. Her voice stayed even, controlled, the way she used to deliver instructions over a radiocom, clipped, designed to keep panic from spreading. The monitor line shifted again. Margaret's eyes flicked to it without meaning to. The pulse slowed, not to peace, but to something closer than it had been. She stopped reading. Is that because of me? Tom didn't smile. He didn't turn it into some warm moment. He simply nodded once. Your voice is predictable. Margaret stared at the word predictable as if it were a compliment and an accusation at the same time. She read again the next day, and the next. 2 weeks passed with the same routine. 5 meters away, back turn, monotone reading of paperwork that meant nothing to her and apparently meant something to Atlas. Margaret never reached for him. She never tried to offer treats through the bars like the other volunteers. She never crouched down and whispered sweet words. She showed up like a medic reporting for duty. And Atlas, from behind her, stayed quiet. Sometimes she heard him shift in the kennel, the soft scrape of paws on bedding. Sometimes a faint exhale. Never a bark. Margaret began to notice things in the in-between moments. The way the monitor spiked, when a metal bucket clinked down the corridor. The way it spiked when a man laughed too loudly in the yard. The way it smoothed it perfect, but smoother when Margaret's voice filled the space like a steady tide. One afternoon, she arrived and found a new page clipped to the binder. Note: during reading sessions, Atlas stress markers decreased by an average of 18%. Margaret stared at the number as if it were a mistake. 18%. Her mind trained for patterns, trained for data code, and ignore it. She brought her chair back to the same spot, 5 meters away, back turned. She began to read. But this time, her voice changed, and it warmer, not soft, just present. Less like she was forcing it. As she spoke, she listened. Not for barking, for breathing. And somewhere behind her, so quiet it could have been imagined, Atlas released a long, slow exhale. Margaret's own lungs responded without permission, matching the rhythm. For the first time in years, she felt her body take a full breath without fighting it. She didn't turn around. Not yet, because the debate wasn't over. The debate was still raging inside her between fear and duty, between survival and surrender, between the part of her that wanted to run and the part that remembered how to stay. But there was something new now: evidence. And Margaret had always trusted evidence more than hope. By week 3, Margaret's routine had become the closest thing to a promise she'd made in years. Same arrival time, same sign-in, same quiet walk past the main yard where other volunteers clipped leashes and moved in practiced arcs. Same 5-meter boundary with Atlas Kennel. But the difference was this: Margaret no longer felt like she was standing outside a storm. She felt like she was standing at its edge with a map. On Monday, Tom brought her a pair of foam ear protectors. Margaret frowned. "For me?" "For you and for him," Tom said, and set a second pair on the bench beside the kennel. The second set was larger, custom strapped to fit over a dog's head without pinching. Margaret stared at them as if they were absurd. Tom's voice stayed neutral. "We're not trying to make him tough. We're trying to make him safe." Safe. The word had weight here. It wasn't a slogan. It was a goal you could measure. That afternoon, Tom didn't ask Margaret to touch Atlas. He asked her to build. Haven Ridge had a workshop, clean tools, a workbench, bins of straps, and padded fabric. Margaret stepped into the space and felt something in her shoulders loosen. Tools were honest. Wood and leather and stitching didn't judge you. Tom set down a rough outline on paper, a simple boot design, thick soles, reinforced around the ankle. "His paws are cracked from old concrete runs," Tom explained. "And he hates anything that feels like a trap. If it pinches or shifts, he panics." Margaret studied the sketch. The problem was clear. The solution had constraints. It felt familiar in the best way. She worked without speaking for an hour, measuring, cutting, testing Velcro tension with careful hands. By the time she finished the first prototype, her mind had gone quiet in that rare way it only did when she was fully occupied. Tom watched her work, then nodded. "You're good at this." Margaret didn't respond, but the compliment lodged somewhere deep. The next day, she built a pressure jacket, snug, not tight. A weighted wrap that could calm a nervous system without restraining it. Tom had seen similar ones used for anxious dogs. Margaret improved it with the precision of someone who understood what panic did to the body. "Like armor," she said before she could stop herself. Tom looked at her. "Yeah, like armor." On Wednesday, the sky turned the color of wet cement. The air grew heavy. The pines held their breath. Margaret noticed before anyone else did. Her body always knew storms first. The low pressure, the distant rumble, the way every nerve began to brace for impact. She was walking past the kennels when thunder rolled far away, soft like a drum beneath a floor. Margaret froze. In the kennel line, a dog whined. Another shifted. A chain tag clinked. The sound ricocheted through her chest. She turned her head toward Atlas' enclosure before she meant to. Atlas was standing. Not barking. Not lunging. Just standing, rigid, eyes wide, ears lowered, muscles locked as if the air had become dangerous. The heart rate monitor on the wall ticked up, faster, faster. Tom appeared at Margaret's shoulder. "We can move him into the quiet room," he said. Margaret's mouth went dry. "He won't let anyone touch him." Tom nodded once. "That's the problem." Another rumble closer. Atlas' body trembled, a small vibration at first, then stronger. He paced one step, then stopped, like his instincts were colliding. Margaret's hands curled into fists. Her own breath tightened. She looked at the ear protectors sitting on the bench, hers and his. She didn't think. Thinking was too slow. She grabbed her own pair and placed them over her ears, sealing out the sharp edges of sound. The world dulled, softened. Then she picked up the larger pair. Her heart slammed as she approached the kennel door. Tom's voice, muffled through the foam, said, "Margaret, you don't have to." But she did. Because if she didn't, the storm would win for both of them. Margaret knelt outside the gate, not entering, keeping the barrier between them. She held the ear protectors up where Atlas could see them, then set them on the ground and backed away to feet. Atlas stared. Thunder rolled again, louder. The vibration ran through the metal bars. Atlas flinched and turned his head as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. Margaret's chest tightened. She slid the ear protectors closer with the tip of her shoe slow, careful, no sudden motion. Then she sat back, hands on her knees, and began to speak. Her voice came out low and steady like the reading sessions. "It's a storm," she said. "It's loud, but it's passing. You're here. You're safe." Atlas didn't move toward the protectors. So Margaret did something unexpected, even to herself. She leaned her shoulder gently against the kennel gate close enough to be present, not close enough to invade. She let Atlas see that she wasn't running. Another thunderclap cracked overhead. Margaret felt her own body flinch, felt her teeth pressed together. But she stayed. Atlas' eyes locked onto hers through the bars, and then slowly, cautiously, lowered his head. He nudged the ear protectors with his nose. Not acceptance, not trust, a test. Margaret didn't move. Atlas nudged again, then pushed one padded cup under his chin as if figuring out how it worked. Tom's breath caught behind Margaret, a sound she barely heard. Outside, the storm deepened. Rain began to tick against the roof. In the kennel corridor, where panic usually multiplied, something strange happened. Two survivors sat with their fear in the dark, both wearing ear protectors, both listening to a softer world. And for the first time, Haven Ridge didn't feel like a place Margaret was serving a sentence. It felt like a place where a sentence could finally end. The next morning, the world looked rinsed clean. Rainwater clung to pine needles. The gravel lot shimmered under a thin winter sun. Margaret stepped out of her car and inhaled air that felt sharper, simpler, like the storm had scraped the sky down to something honest. She walked toward the kennels with the same measured pace, but her body no longer braced as hard for the sounds of the place. The ear protectors from yesterday sat in her mind like proof. Panic could rise, and still it could pass. Tom met her at the corridor with a paper cup of coffee, which she didn't take. He didn't insist. "How'd you sleep?" he asked. Margaret hesitated. "Better than usual." Tom nodded once, as if he'd expected that. "He ate last night." Margaret's gaze flicked to Atlas' kennel before she could stop it. "He didn't after the storm?" "Usually he won't," Tom said. "But he did." Margaret's mouth went dry. The smallest changes felt huge here, like watching ice crack on a lake on sound, and suddenly you knew spring was possible. When they reached Atlas' enclosure, Margaret stopped. Atlas wasn't in the far corner. He was closer to the gate, lying with his front paws stretched out, head lifted. Alert but not rigid, watching the corridor the way he always did, hyperware measured. His eyes found Margaret immediately. Something tightened in her chest. Not fear this time. Recognition. Tom clipped the heart rate sensor to the kennel wall. "We've been collecting data," he said. "Your voice lowers his markers. Your presence seems to keep him from spiraling." Margaret stared at Atlas' chain collar, at the faint rub marks beneath it. "Is still wearing that. He'll panic if we remove it too fast," Tom said. "It's familiar, even if it's awful." Margaret swallowed. Familiar, even if awful. The words hit too close. Tom stepped back. "Today you're going to try something different." Margaret didn't look away from Atlas. "What?" Tom's voice softened. "You're going to offer your hand. Not inside. Just through the gate gap. I'm down still. He decides." Margaret's stomach tightened. "I can't." Tom didn't argue. He simply said, "You don't have to touch him. You just have to give him the choice." Choice. Margaret hadn't realized how long it had been since she'd trusted that word. She crouched slowly. Her knees creaked. She hated how her body announced its age with little betrayals. But Atlas didn't react to the sound. He only watched, eyes steady. Margaret slid her hand toward the narrow space at the bottom of the gate where fingers could reach, but teeth couldn't. Tom had designed the enclosure like that on purpose. She kept her palm down, fingers relaxed, showing as little shape as possible. Her hand trembled. She forced it still. Atlas didn't move at first. His ears twitched. His nostrils flared as he tested the air. Margaret's heartbeat thudded hard in her chest. She kept her eyes on his paws, not his fashion old tactic, one she'd used on people too when eye contact felt like pressure. Second stretch. Then Atlas rose. Not quickly, not cautiously, but just with a slow, deliberate shift, like he was deciding whether the floor was worth standing on. He approached the gate in 3 quiet steps. Margaret's breath caught. Atlas lowered his head and sniffed the air near her hand. His nose didn't touch her yet. He inhaled slow and deep, reading her the way she read reports. Margaret didn't move. Atlas' nose brushed the back of her fingers. It was feather light, almost nothing, but Margaret felt it like a shock. Her muscles locked. Her mind flashed bright. Tom's voice from behind her, low and steady, "Stay." Margaret swallowed hard. She exhaled, forcing her shoulders down. Atlas sniffed again, then so carefully it looked like it cost him something, nudged his muzzle against her hand, and held it there for one long breath. Margaret's throat burned. She didn't pet him. She didn't reach. She simply let him rest, his muzzle on her skin, the warmth of him real and quiet. When he pulled back, Margaret's hand stayed in place, trembling less now. Atlas' gaze lifted to her face for a heartbeat. and in that brief moment, Margaret saw it something like a question. Not will you hurt me, but will you stay? Margaret's eyes stung. She withdrew her hands slowly and stood, as if moving too fast would shatter whatever fragile thread had formed between them. Tom watched her expression. That's the first time he's done that with anyone. Margaret's voice came out rough. Why? Tom glanced down at the heart rate monitor, then back at Atlas. Because you don't demand. You don't push. You understand what it means to have your body say no when you're trying to say yes. Margaret turned away, blinking hard. But the day wasn't done with her yet. Later, in the small observation room, Tom showed her a chartreuse of numbers, timestamps, notes, data from the past week. There's something else, Tom said, tapping a line on the graph. Look here. Margaret leaned in. The spikes weren't random. They clustered around specific moments. Moments when Margaret's hands shook. Moments when her breathing changed. Moments right before she stepped back. Right before her chest tightened. Right before her eyes went unfocused. Tom said, Atlas stress markers rise before yours. Not after. Before. Margaret's skin prickled. That doesn't make sense. It does, Tom replied. He smells it. Margaret stared at him. Smells what? Tom's voice was careful, almost reverent. The chemical change in sweat when someone is about to panic. Dogs can detect things we can't. Blood sugar drops, seizures, all kinds of shifts. Atlas reacts to your panic before you feel it fully. Margaret's heart thudded. Tom slid another paper toward her, an article printout. A medical summary about psychiatric service dogs and early warning cues. You're telling me, Margaret whispered, he's not just a rescue dog. Tom met her eyes. He might be a PTSD alert dog. Margaret's breath caught. For years her fear of dogs had been a wall. Now the wall had a crack in it. And through that crack, something impossible was forming. Atlas wasn't just a dog she had to endure to satisfy a court order. He was a living alarm system for the storm inside her own she hadn't been able to predict. One she had never been able to control. Margaret looked back through the observation window. Atlas lay near the gate again, head up, watching. Not begging, not performing, waiting. And Margaret realized the midpoint truth that shifted everything. She wasn't training Atlas to survive. Atlas might be training her. The notice came on a Tuesday, clipped to the facility's front desk like it belonged there. Official letterhead. Blocky language. No warmth. No room for context. Tom read it once, jaw tightening, then handed it to Margaret without a word. Margaret's eyes skimmed the page and snagged on the phrase that turned her stomach cold. Order of seizure and euthanasia review, animal deemed high risk. Asterisk. Her fingers stiffened around the paper. They can't. Tom's voice was flat, controlled. They can. Margaret's gaze dropped to the next lines. Prior involvement in an illegal fighting operation. Unknown by history. Potential threat to public safety. Immediate transfer to temporary holding pending evaluation. Atlas' name was printed like a criminal record. Margaret swallowed hard. The room felt smaller. The air felt thinner. Who reported him? She asked, though she already sensed the answer. Not one person, but a system. A paper trail that had finally caught up. Tom dragged a hand over his face. A regional animal oversight group. They audit rescues like mine. Someone flagged Atlas intake notes. The fighting ring connection spooked them. Margaret heard the words, but couldn't make them fit reality. Atlas wasn't lunging at strangers. He wasn't snarling at volunteers. He barely took treats from a gloved hand. He had been silent, controlled, learning. It's not dangerous, she said, sharper than she meant to. Tom met her eyes. They don't care what he is today. They care what he was forced to be. Forced. Margaret's throat burned. The facility seemed to hold its breath while Tom made calls. He spoke to caseworkers, supervisors, a lawyer friend. He kept his tone respectful, measured, like a man trying to convince a wall to move. Margaret sat in a chair nearby, hands clenched in her lap, listening to the rhythm of rejection. We can provide updated behavioral assessments, Tom said into the phone. We have heart rate data, stress reduction logs. This made progress. A pause. Tom's face tightened. Yes, I understand policy, but policy isn't the dog. Another pause. Tom's voice dropped. Yes, she's court-ordered community service, but she's been consistent and supervised. Margaret's spine stiffened at the word she, asterisk, as if her name didn't matter either. Tom listened, then said, please just grant an extension. A hearing. Let us bring evidence. The call ended. Tom set the phone down gently, like slamming it would make something inside him break loose. Well? Margaret asked, though her voice came out too small. Tom exhaled. They're transferring him tomorrow morning. Margaret stared. To where? County holding, Tom said. They'll keep him in an isolation run. Then the review board meets. And if they decide he's too high risk... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Margaret stood so fast the chair legs scraped the floor. The sound spiked her nerves, but she didn't care. We'll stop them. Tom shook his head once. We can file an emergency appeal. But the likelihood don't, Margaret snapped. Don't talk to me like it's already over. Tom's eyes softened, and that softness hurt more than anger. Margaret, I'm trying to be honest. Honest felt like a blade. Margaret walked out into the yard, paper still in her hand, wind catching it like it wanted to tear it away. The pines swayed. Somewhere a gate latch clinked. She flinched, then forced herself not to. She marched to Atlas' kennel corridor like a person walking into a fire. Atlas was there near the gate, as if he'd sensed something in the air. His eyes found her immediately. Margaret's breath caught. She crouched at the usual distance, not trusting herself to get closer. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the notice again, as if reading it twice might change the words. Atlas watched her face, then dropped his gaze to her hands. The heart rate monitor on the wall ticked upward slowly, steadily. He was picking up her fear before she admitted it. Margaret pressed her palm against the metal bar. Cold. Unforgiving. I try, she whispered, though she didn't know if she meant trying for him or trying for herself. Atlas rose and stepped closer. He didn't touch her this time. He only stood there, breathing, listening with his whole body. Margaret's chest tightened, panic licking at the edges. And then she felt its old familiar spiral beginning. Not from the dog, from the helplessness, from the idea that something she'd finally begun to trust could be taken away with one signature. She backed away, one step, then another, as if distance could protect her from the pain of losing him. Atlas' head lowered slightly, tracking her movement. Not chasing, not pleading, just watching like he was memorizing her. Tom appeared at the corridor entrance. They'll be here at 8, he said quietly. Margaret's hands curled into fists. They'll go to the hearing. Tom hesitated. Your record won't help. That was the punch. Clean, precise. Her history, her panic, the citation, the label, everything that had brought her here now made her the weakest witness for the defense. Margaret swallowed. So because I'm unstable, they'll kill him. Tom's face tightened. They'll call it procedure. Margaret looked back at Atlas through the bars. For weeks, she had learned to show up, to breathe, to stay. Now the world was telling her that staying didn't matter. That progress didn't matter. That a past you didn't choose could erase a future you were building. Atlas stood in the shadow of the kennel, quiet as ever. And Margaret realized, with a sudden sick clarity, that she wasn't just afraid of losing him. She was afraid of what losing him would prove, that nothing she touched could ever be saved. Atlas was gone by noon. Margaret didn't watch them take him. She told herself she didn't watch because it would make it worse. But the truth was harder. She didn't trust her own body not to betray her in front of strangers with uniforms and clipboards. She stood in the workshop instead, hands braced on the workbench, staring at the pressure jacket she'd sewn for him, heavy, careful, meant to steady a nervous system that had never been allowed to rest. Outside, she heard the faint rattle of a vehicle gate, the crunch of tires on gravel, a muffled voice, then silence again. It should have felt like relief. No dog, no trigger, no risk. Instead, it felt like a room had been emptied of oxygen. Tom found her there an hour later. He didn't speak at first. He didn't have to. His shoulders looked heavier, as if he'd aged in one morning. They wouldn't let me come close, Margaret said, voice flat. Tom nodded slowly. Holding facility policy. They treat every flagged dog like a hazard. Hazard. Margaret stared at the word in her mind until it blurred into something uglier, disposable. Tom set a folder on the bench beside her. This is the appeal paperwork. I filed what I could. We'll get a hearing date, but it might not be in time. Margaret's fingers twitched. She didn't reach for the folder. Tom watched her face. You can still log your hours doing other tasks. The court will. I don't care about the court, Margaret cut in. The words surprised her. The court had been the reason for everything. The chain that had dragged her here. The threat that had cornered her into showing up. Now it felt small. Petty. She crouched at the usual distance, not trusting herself to get closer. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the notice again, as if reading it twice might change the words. Atlas watched her face, then dropped his gaze to her hands. The heart rate monitor on the wall ticked upward slowly, steadily. He was picking up her fear before she admitted it. Margaret pressed her palm against the metal bar. Cold. Unforgiving. I try, she whispered, though she didn't know if she meant trying for him or trying for herself. Atlas rose and stepped closer. He didn't touch her this time. He only stood there, breathing, listening with his whole body. Margaret's chest tightened, panic licking at the edges. And then she felt its old familiar spiral beginning. Not from the dog, from the helplessness, from the idea that something she'd finally begun to trust could be taken away with one signature. She backed away, one step, then another, as if distance could protect her from the pain of losing him. Atlas' head lowered slightly, tracking her movement. Not chasing, not pleading, just watching like he was memorizing her. Tom appeared at the corridor entrance. They'll be here at 8, he said quietly. Margaret's hands curled into fists. They'll go to the hearing. Tom hesitated. Your record won't help. That was the punch. Clean, precise. Her history, her panic, the citation, The label, everything that had brought her here now made her the weakest witness for the defense. Margaret swallowed. So because I'm unstable, they'll kill him. Tom's face tightened. They'll call it procedure. Margaret looked back at Atlas through the bars. For weeks, she had learned to show up, to breathe, to stay. Now the world was telling her that staying didn't matter. That progress didn't matter. That a past you didn't choose could erase a future you were building. Atlas stood in the shadow of the kennel, quiet as ever. And Margaret realized, with a sudden sick clarity, that she wasn't just afraid of losing him. She was afraid of what losing him would prove, that nothing she touched could ever be saved. Atlas was gone by noon. Margaret didn't watch them take him. She told herself she didn't watch because it would make it worse. But the truth was harder. She didn't trust her own body not to betray her in front of strangers with uniforms and clipboards. She stood in the workshop instead, hands braced on the workbench, staring at the pressure jacket shed sewn for him heavy, careful, meant to steady a nervous system that had never been allowed to rest. Outside, she heard the faint rattle of a vehicle gate, the crunch of tires on gravel, a muffled voice, then silence again. It should have felt like relief. No dog, no trigger, no risk. Instead, it felt like a room had been emptied of oxygen. Tom found her there an hour later. He didn't speak at first. He didn't have to. His shoulders looked heavier, as if he'd aged in one morning. They wouldn't let me come close, Margaret said, voice flat. Tom nodded slowly. Holding facility policy. They treat every flagged dog like a hazard. Hazard. Margaret stared at the word in her mind until it blurred into something uglier, disposable. Tom set a folder on the bench beside her. This is the appeal paperwork. I filed what I could. We'll get a hearing date, but it might not be in time. Margaret's fingers twitched. She didn't reach for the folder. Tom watched her face. You can still log your hours doing other tasks. The court will. I don't care about the court, Margaret cut in. The words surprised her. The court had been the reason for everything. The chain that had dragged her here. The threat that had cornered her into showing up. Now it felt small. Petty. Tom's gaze sharpened. Margaret, no, she said, and her voice rose, not into a shout, but into something raw. I followed their rules. I showed up. I did what they asked. And the moment it mattered, they looked at a piece of paper and decided he wasn't worth saving. Tom's jaw worked. It's not personal. It is, Margaret said, breath trembling. It's always personal when someone decides you're beyond help. Tom didn't argue, because he knew she was right. That afternoon, Margaret drove home with the pressure jacket on the passenger seat like a ghost. The house greeted her with its usual quiet, safe, orderly, controlled, and unbearable. She stood in the entryway and listened. No kennel gates. No distant volunteers. No soft paws shifting on bedding. Just the hum of her refrigerator and the ticking of a clock she'd bought years ago because its sound was faint enough not to bother her. She set the jacket on the kitchen table. It slumped like it had lost its purpose. Margaret lowered herself into a chair and stared at it until the light outside the windows began to fade. Her phone buzzed twice. A message from Tom, don't isolate. Call me if it gets heavy. Margaret didn't reply. Another buzz on email notification. A court reminder. A system that never forgot how to demand. Margaret turned the phone face down. In the living room, a cardboard box sat under a shelf, half hidden. Margaret hadn't opened it in years. The box held the things she couldn't throw away and couldn't look at too long. She found herself walking toward it like she was being pulled. Her hands shook as she slid it out. Inside were small objects wrapped in old cloth, a patch with faded stitching, a tarnished medal, a folded photograph she couldn't bring herself to unfold, and at the bottom cold and familiar brass whistle. She lifted it carefully, as if it might burn. The whistle wasn't just metal, it was a command, a signal, a tool she'd used when her voice couldn't carry over chaos. It meant follow me, hold the line, stay together. Margaret stared at it until her eyes stung. In the silence of her home, she realized what losing Atlas had truly done. It hadn't just taken away a dog. It had taken away the one living proof that she could still connect without breaking something. That she could still soothe instead of destroy. That she could still be useful. Without him, she felt like she'd been pushed back into the version of herself the world preferred, quiet, hidden, manageable. A person who didn't disturb anyone. Margaret's breath hitched. The familiar panic began to resonate sharp, not sudden, but slow and smothering. Like a tide coming in while you pretend the shoreline isn't moving. She pressed her palms to the table and forced her breathing into countable steps. In, cold, ow. Her gaze fell on the whistle again, and an uncomfortable thought surfaced, a she didn't want, but couldn't ignore. Atlas was in a holding run right now, alone with his triggers. Metal clinks, strange voices, sterile air, no predictability. If she could picture that and still sit safely at her kitchen table, then what did that say about her? Margaret's jaw tightened. A different kind of heat rose in her chestnut. Panic. Resolve. She stood abruptly, chair scraping the floor. She didn't flinch this time. She went to the bedroom closet and pulled out an old duffel bag. It smelled faintly of dust and cedar. She unzipped it and stared at what was inside. Gear she'd sworn she'd never touch again. Not weapons, not anything dangerous. Just the old field jacket, the boots built for long walks, the rain shell folded tight, the flashlight with fresh batteries because she'd never stopped preparing for worst cases, even when she tried to pretend she was done. She laid the items on the bed with slow care. Then she pinned the brass whistle to the jacket zipper pull, the way she used to. Tom's eyes widened. Margaret, Atlas is in county holding. It's not ours right now. Then we get him back, she said. Tom stepped closer, lowering his voice. Listen to yourself. If you do this, you risk violating the court order. You risk charges. I risk losing the only person who ever tried to pull me back, Margaret cut in. Her voice shook once, then steadied. And I'm done letting fear decide what I do. Tom stared at her and she saw him weighing it, law versus life, procedure versus a man alone in the woods. The thunder in the distance made the decision feel smaller. Tom exhaled hard. If we do this, we do it smart. Margaret nodded. Smart. 40 minutes later, they were at county holding. The building was squat and gray, surrounded by chain-link fencing. A clerk behind bulletproof glass looked up with bored impatience. We're here about Atlas, Tom said, showing paperwork. We need temporary release for emergency search support. The clerk didn't even glance at it. No can do. Review pending. Tom leaned in. There's a missing person. The storm is coming. This dog can assist. The clerk shook his head like he'd heard 1,000 stories. Policy. Margaret felt something cold and old in her chest, same helplessness as the grocery store, the same dismissal. A system that couldn't hear humans unless they spoke in the correct language. Tom pulled Margaret aside, jaw clenched. This is the wall. Margaret stared at the locked interior door, then at the hallway sign that read authorized personnel only. Her mind did something it hadn't done in a long time. It planned. That night at Haven Ridge, she'd watched Tom's friend an on-call technician enter through the side service entrance with a badge. She'd seen the motion, the timing, the routine. It wasn't magic. It was habit. Margaret's voice was low. There's a side door. Tom stiffened. Margaret, I'm not here to hurt anyone, she said. I'm here to save Frank. A long beat. Tom's face tightened in frustration and then, to Margaret's surprise, he nodded once. 2 minutes. That's all we can afford. They moved fast, quiet, staying in the blind spots between security cameras. Tom knew the layout from years of navigating bureaucracy. Margaret's heart pounded, but she didn't freeze. She didn't spiral. She followed the steps like a drill. The side door was locked. Tom produced a key tag. He shouldn't have had an emergency facility liaison pass, kept for disasters. He swiped. The lock clicked. They slipped inside. Margaret's ears filled with the sterile hum of fluorescent lighting. The smell was harsh, clean, wrong. Every sound echoed their shoes, a distant clang of metal, a muffled bark from somewhere deeper. Margaret's stomach tightened, but she kept moving. They found Atlas in an isolation run at the back, lying rigid, as open body pressed against the wall, as if trying to become smaller. A chain collar sat around his neck again, heavier than before. The sight of it made Margaret's jaw clench. Atlas' head lifted at their approach. His eyes locked onto Margaret, and for the first time, he made a sound, not a bark, not a growl, a low, strained whine that vibrated with confusion. Margaret crouched outside the gate, careful. Atlas, she whispered, voice steady, familiar. It's me. Atlas' breathing sped up. His body trembled. Then thunder cracked outside a closer now, rolling across the building like a giant turning in his sleep. Atlas flinched hard, pressing back. Margaret's own chest tightened. She did the only thing she knew. She unclipped her brass whistle from her jacket knit to blow it, not yet, but to hold it, to feel the cool metal ground her. Then she reached for the pressure jacket she'd brought, folded in her bag like a promise. She slid it through the kennel slot slowly. Atlas stared at it. Margaret's voice stayed calm. Armored, she said softly. Remember? Atlas' nose moved, testing the scent. Familiar fabric. Familiar hands. He inched forward, trembling, and nudged the jacket. Tom worked the latch with shaking fingers. We have to move, he whispered. Margaret nodded. I know. The door opened. Atlas didn't bolt. He stepped out cautiously, eyes wide, body low, as if expecting punishment for leaving. Margaret did something she hadn't done before in open space. She moved toward him, not reaching high, not sudden. She slid down onto her knees in front of him and opened her arms, not to grab, but to shelter. Thunder cracked again. The building vibrated. Atlas froze. Margaret pressed her own body around him, close enough to be a shield, gentle enough not to trap, like a living pressure wrap. It's okay, she breathed. It's passing. Stay with me. Atlas, trembling, eased by a fraction. Tom clipped a leash on, hands quick. They moved out of the holding facility, out into the rising wind, and toward the woods where Frank Wilder had walked with a letter in his pocket and no plan to return. Margaret didn't feel like a woman breaking rules anymore. She felt like a leader making a choice. When they reached the trailhead, the sky was bruised purple. The trees swayed. Rain began again, cold and insistent. Search teams were gathering, but their flashlights looked small against the spreading darkness. A deputy approached Tom. "You can't bring that dog." Margaret stepped forward before Tom could speak. Her voice cut clean through the wind. "Is trained to detect panic. You can find him." The deputy's eyes narrowed. "Mum, who are you?" Margaret lifted her chin. "Someone who refuses to lose another soldier." Then she raised the brass whistle to her lips. Not as a weapon, as a signal, as a promise. She blew. The note pierced the stormcloud unwavering. Atlas had snapped up. His body shifted not into fear, but into purpose. And he began to move, nose low to the wet earth, pulling them into the trees as thunder rolled above like distant drums. Margaret followed, heart pounding, fear present but not in control. Because somewhere ahead in the dark, a man was waiting at the edge. And she was done arriving too late. Atlas' nose moved, testing the scent. Familiar fabric. Familiar hands. He inched forward, trembling, and nudged the jacket. Tom worked the latch with shaking fingers. "We have to move," he whispered. Margaret nodded. "I know." The door opened. Atlas didn't bolt. He stepped out cautiously, eyes wide, body low as if expecting punishment for leaving. Margaret did something she hadn't done before in open space. She moved toward him. Not reaching high. Not sudden. She slid down onto her knees in front of him and opened her arms not to grab, but to shelter. Thunder cracked again. The building vibrated. Atlas froze. Margaret pressed her own body around him close enough to be a shield, gentle enough not to trap. Like a living pressure wrap. "It's okay," she breathed. "It's passing. Stay with me." Atlas trembling eased by a fraction. Tom clipped a leash on hands quick. They moved out of the holding facility, out into the rising wind, and toward the woods where Frank Wilder had walked with a letter in his pocket and no plan to return. Margaret didn't feel like a woman breaking rules anymore. She felt like a leader making a choice. When they reached the trailhead, the sky was bruised purple. The trees swayed. Rain began again, cold and insistent. Search teams were gathering, but their flashlights looked small against the spreading darkness. A deputy approached Tom. "You can't bring that dog." Margaret stepped forward before Tom could speak. Her voice cut clean through the wind. "Is trained to detect panic. You can find him." The deputy's eyes narrowed. "Mum, who are you?" Margaret lifted her chin. "Someone who refuses to lose another soldier." Then she raised the brass whistle to her lips. Not as a weapon, as a signal, as a promise. She blew. The note pierced the stormcloud unwavering. Atlas had snapped up. His body shifted not into fear, but into purpose. And he began to move, nose low to the wet earth, pulling them into the trees as thunder rolled above like distant drums. Margaret followed, heart pounding, fear present but not in control. Because somewhere ahead in the dark, a man was waiting at the edge. And she was done arriving too late. The forest closed around them, like a held breath. Rain slicked the leaves. Mud pulled at their boots. The search team's flashlights scattered into pale beams that barely cut through the dark. But Atlas moved with quiet certainty, nose low, body angled into the wind as if the storm itself were speaking to him. Margaret followed close behind, one hand wrapped around the leash, the other steadying herself against branches and slit bark. Her heart raced not with panic, but with urgency. A clear, focused burn. Atlas slowed suddenly. Margaret felt it before she saw it shift in his posture. The tension in the leash. His breathing changed, quickening. "It's got something," Tom said behind her. Thunder rolled again, loud enough to vibrate through bone. Atlas flinched, then stopped entirely, paws braced. Margaret dropped to her knees in the wet leaves and pulled him close, pressing her shoulder against his chest, wrapping her arms around his broad frame the way she'd practiced in the holding facility. "It's okay," she murmured into his fur, voice low and steady. "I've got you. Stay with me." Atlas' body trembled then steadied. Margaret reached for the whistle at her chest and blew a single, controlled no, not loud, not sharp. A command meant only for those who understood it. Atlas lifted his head. He inhaled deeply, then turned sharply left, pulling Margaret toward a narrow, half-hidden path where the ground dipped and the air smelled different, even sharper. They moved downhill, rain increasing, water pooling around their boots. Then Atlas stopped. Margaret's flashlight beam caught a shape near the edge of a clearing. A man. Frank stood at the boundary where solid ground gave way to dark water, shoulders hunched, coat soaked, staring into the marsh as if it were calling him. "Frank," Margaret said softly, afraid to break the fragile moment. Frank didn't turn. Atlas stepped forward slowly, no leash tension, no rush. He approached the man and saw calm, grounded. Then, just as Margaret had taught him, Atlas leaned forward and rested his head gently against Frank's hand. Frank flinched at first, then stilled. His fingers curled into Atlas' fur, as if they'd found something solid in a world that had turned liquid. I didn't want anyone to follow me, Frank said hoarsely. Margaret took one step closer. I know. Frank finally turned, eyes red and tired. I didn't think anyone would. Margaret swallowed. You were wrong. Rain fell harder, but the storm seemed to loosen its grip, as if the moment had shifted something unseen. Frank sank to his knees, hands still on Atlas. His shoulders shook not with drama, but with release. Search team lights appeared through the trees, voices calling out. Frank was safe. When they guided him back toward the trailhead, Atlas walked at his side, steady and quiet, as if this had always been his purpose. 2 days later, the courtroom was silent in a different way. Margaret stood at the podium, not hunched, not apologetic. Atlas sat beside her, wearing the pressure jacket she'd made, posture calm, eyes alert. She spoke without notes. She spoke of chemical markers in sweat, of early panic detection, of data collected ethically and carefully. She spoke of how Atlas had alerted before she collapsed, before fear took control. She spoke of a man found in the dark. The judge listened. When Margaret finished, there was no dramatic pause. No speech. The judge simply said, the order of euthanasia is rescinded. Margaret's breath caught. Furthermore, the judge continued, this court recognizes the therapeutic and practical value of this work. Ms. Hill, you are authorized to develop a pilot program under supervision for veterans paired with rescue animals. Margaret closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one. Later, the beach stretched wide and quiet beneath a soft, gold evening sky. Margaret walked barefoot along the shore, the sound of waves gentle, predictable. Atlas trotted beside her, leash loose in her hand. Ahead, another person passed with a dog. Margaret felt the old tightening stirth fade. She stopped, knelt and unclipped Atlas' leash. Go on, she said, smiling. Atlas ran, powerful and free, paws kicking up sand as he charged toward the water, then turned back to look at her, checking in, always. Margaret stood there, wind in her hair, watching the echoes of her past dissolve into the sound of the sea. Some echoes didn't break you. Some became your way home. Some stories don't end when the danger passes. They stay with us because they reveal something quietly profound about how healing really works. Unbroken Echoes is not a story about a hero who defeats fear. It is about two broken beings. Margaret and Atlas learned that healing is not the absence of fear, but the ability to move forward while carrying it gently. Margaret never got over her trauma. Atlas never forgot what had been done to him. What changed was not their pasts but their relationship to those pasts. This story reminds us that healing is relational. Margaret could not heal alone. Atlas could not either. What saved them was not isolation or toughness, but connection, slow, consensual, and built on trust. Progress is often invisible before it is undeniable. No one noticed Margaret's growth until the moment it mattered most. Healing often happens quietly, in routines, in small acts of showing up, long before the world recognizes it. Labels are not destinies. Unstable, dangerous, high risk. These were words placed on Margaret and Atlas by systems that could not see them fully. The story challenges us to ask how often we reduce complex lives to simple judgments and what we lose when we do. Strength doesn't always look loud. Atlas didn't bark. Margaret didn't shout. Their strength showed up as stillness, patience, and the courage to stay present when leaving would have been easier. What if the very thing we fear is not what will destroy us but what will finally help us understand ourselves? Questions for you. Would love to hear from you. Take a moment to reflect. Have you ever been judged by a single moment, without anyone seeing the full story behind it? Has there been a person or even an animal who helped you heal without trying to fix you? What fear have you been avoiding that might actually be asking for patience, not avoidance? And if healing came slowly, quietly, without applause, would you still recognize it? We invite you to share your own experience, whether it's about healing, loss, recovery, or an unexpected connection that changed your life. You can leave a comment below if you're comfortable sharing publicly. Or, if you prefer privacy, you're welcome to send your story to the email pinned in the description. Our team may ask permission to share it anonymously, so your experience can become a light for someone else.